black guys.
Check one. Check. Hello. Hello, DC citizens, DC natives, visitors.
Yeah.
The NATO alliance must be disbanded. The NATO alliance must be disbanded for the prosperity of the United States and for peace abroad and at home. How could I say such a thing with all these blue flags all over the place with the compass rose? How could I say such a thing when so many elite guests are gathered here discussing the building up of NATO in our Congress right now? So many guests from abroad meeting with our politicians here. It seems like DC politicians can't agree on anything, right? Democrats, Republicans, the occasional third party, always fighting over this and that. Who's going to pay for it? Where are you going to put it? Why are you going to do it? We can't afford it. And yet the one thing they do agree on is expanding our military budget year after year. About expanding this brutal NATO alliance that does nothing to expand prosperity here at home, does nothing to keep peace abroad, is no longer even the minimum defensive alliance that it used to be, and is rather today an offensive alliance. Let's talk about the financial burden that NATO imposes upon us here in the United States. We spend over $800 billion on military spending. More than half of our discretionary budget every year is spent on the military, with over $100 billion of that spent on just the NATO alliance. $100 billion. We have 50 states plus the District of Columbia here in the United States. Imagine $2 billion a year for your state at home. You could build schools, you could build roads, you could build hospitals. But when our Democrat and Republican politicians get together, oh, they scratch their heads. How can you pay for it? How can you do it? But they never scratch their heads when it comes to expanding the military, expanding NATO, pushing it closer and closer to Russia, pushing it closer and closer in the Middle East. Now wanting to expand NATO into China's shores. What did China ever do to me except make everything that I use for dirt cheap?
You guys are lunatics.
Yeah, keep giving over your taxpayer dollars to Zelensky's cocaine habit, idiot.
They say that we're the lunatics. I think it's lunatical to keep expanding an offensive military alliance closer and closer to the other main nuclear power in Europe. I mean Russia. Imagine what we could achieve if even a fraction of this over $100 billion that we spend was spent on pressing domestic needs. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Our healthcare system is underfunded. 180 people die a day because we do not have even a basic Medicare for all, state-funded healthcare policy like even our imperialist allies like the UK, France, and Spain have. The American Society of Civil Engineers estimates that we need to invest $2.6 trillion by 2029 just to bring our infrastructure to a state of good repair. But the politicians say, how can we pay for it? But they have no problem spending $850 billion on the military, $130 billion on NATO. What could we do with it here at home? Next, let's consider NATO's actions since the end of the Cold War. NATO was originally formed in 1949 to counter Soviet aggression. But since then, NATO's purpose has become increasingly nebulous and aggressive since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Instead of maintaining peace, NATO has often acted provocatively. The alliance's expansion eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact countries and even ex-Soviet states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, has been perceived by Russia as a direct threat. Logically, how would any of you all feel if Russia had a military alliance with Chile, and then a military alliance with Argentina, and a military alliance with Brazil, all the time saying, hey, we're a defensive alliance. We're just defending our sovereign interests 2,000 miles away from the United States of America. And then what would you say if Russia wanted to expand that military alliance into Mexico? Of course you would demand that our politicians do something about it, and rightfully so. And so how can you call this Russian war in Ukraine as unprovoked? It may be the most provoked war in history. We've been continually provoking it, and our politicians know that we're provoking it. The current head of the CIA, William Burns, was the ambassador to Russia in the 2000s under the Bush administration. He specifically consulted with every Russian politician on every level. We know this thanks to what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange revealed, and the so-called Niet means Niet cable. Our current head of the CIA, William Burns, knows specifically that expanding NATO eastward has been a huge provocation towards Russia. Russia already went to war in Georgia in 2008 over exactly this. Now let's talk about NATO's provocations even beyond the Atlantic. Let's talk about a country in Africa that had the highest life expectancy on the African continent, that was actually expanding infrastructure for its citizens, providing for school, providing for rights for its citizens. I'm talking about NATO, which in 2011, I'm talking about the country of Libya, the country with the highest life expectancy on the African continent. And in 2011, the NATO alliance said, well, we have to bomb Libya, we have to murder Muammar Gaddafi to keep their citizens safe. And now there's a literal genocide happening in Gaza. No talk of imposing a fly zone, no talk of having NATO peacekeeping troops on the ground. Why? Because it's just nothing but lies and more hypocrisy from these DC and Western politicians. Nothing but lies and hypocrisy, because that's all they have, because they know that NATO doesn't keep us safe. They know that they spend $130 billion on NATO while giving us nothing here at home. Walk in any direction, you'll find homeless people here. You'll find people begging for change. You'll find potholes in the roads. Why are we closing schools in the United States? Why are we closing hospitals and spending more and more on this destructive NATO alliance? NATO is dragging us towards the brink of nuclear war. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine is dragging us towards nuclear war with Russia, the main nuclear power aside from the United States. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, global military expenditure reached a record $2.1 trillion in 2021, which much of this driven by the NATO-Russia arms race. This is not a path to peace, it's a path to potential catastrophe. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has set the doomsday clock to 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. Imagine a different future, one where the resources spent on NATO are instead invested in our own country. What could your state do with an extra $2 billion a year? You could build schools, you could build hospitals, you could repair your roads. We just had the 695 bridge in Baltimore collapse. How long will it be till this bridge is repaired? How much longer of hour-long backups on 95 do we have to endure in this area while we send tens of billions of dollars to a destructive military alliance abroad? But why won't the politicians do anything? Why won't they disband this offensive alliance? Because of the profits of these military contractors. You see them all around. Drive into Northern Virginia, you'll see fancy headquarters of all these buildings. Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Lockheed & Martin, Northrop Grumman, BAE. They all have shiny new buildings all the time, all their millions of contractors. Just about every single congressional district in the USA has some business that's doing business with these weapons manufacturers. Why? So that when politicians want to actually peel back the war states somewhat, want to reinvest in at home, they're always told, oh, but what about the jobs? What about the jobs in these factories? So in conclusion, disbanding NATO is not a step backward, no matter what these politicians tell you. I'm not afraid of Russia. I'm not afraid of China. I'm not afraid of Iran. I'm afraid of not being able to have a job next year. I'm afraid of my landlord raising rent because they're just trying to keep up. I'm afraid of the bridge in my town collapsing, ruining my commute, killing poor workers that are just trying to survive. I'm afraid of the next generation having to choose between medicine, food, education. I'm afraid of spiraling student debt. These are the things that I'm afraid of as an American, not Russia, not China, not what Iran is doing. So, my fellow citizens, we must disband the NATO alliance, the brutal NATO alliance that reappropriates desperately needed resources that we need here abroad, one that's making us less safe abroad, dragging us towards nuclear war. The time has come to rethink our commitments and invest in a better future for all Americans. Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO! NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Thank you.
Actually, maybe better. Should have seen by your friend. Hello. Is it on? Is it on? No, it's the
Your
speaker
thing's
on.
on. Your thing's on.
No. Hello. There we go. Hello. Next up, we're going to have our guest, Miguel, from Spain. He's going to talk about what NATO has done to Spain and the threat it poses to his country in Europe, Spain.
Muchas gracias. Pueblo de Estados Unidos, ¿para qué está reunida ahora la OTAN en Washington?
People of the United States, why is this meeting happening in Washington of NATO?
Está reunida para echar más gasolina al fuego de la guerra contra Rusia en lugar de buscar un alto el fuego y negociar la paz en Ucrania.
This meeting is pouring gasoline on the fire that is the current war between Russia and the Ukraine, and is potentially threatening peace in all of Europe.
Está reunida la OTAN para intensificar sus provocaciones contra la República Popular China y contra la República Popular de Corea, arrastrando a los gobiernos títeres de Corea del Sur, Japón, Australia y Nueva Zelanda.
This meeting is potentially threatening not only stability within Eastern Europe, but also stability within Asia, with the close proximity and the meetings taking place in this city today between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, in the NATO alliance.
Y está reunida para seguir colaborando con el genocidio sionista del pueblo palestino.
This meeting is also taking place while the United States funds the genocide of the peoples of Palestine, conducted by the Israeli Zionist criminal regime.
El imperialismo occidental solo es una fiera malherida que intenta contrarrestar el declive de su economía y de su dominación a través del complejo militar industrial.
Disband NATO.
The U.S. imperialist system and the Western imperialist system is intent on terrorizing the peoples of the world and looting the world as we know it.
El gasto militar de Estados Unidos es el 40% del total mundial, más que la suma de los 10 países siguientes en gasto de defensa.
This alliance is more than 40 nations and more than 10 nations with active conflicts or potential conflicts.
Tiene al menos 750 bases militares en 80 países.
The U.S. with 800 military bases abroad.
A pesar de tanto despilfarro en medios de destrucción, no puede impedir que Rusia siga avanzando con éxito hacia su objetivo.
With the United States putting this imperialist pressure on the peoples of Russia and the peoples of the world, it is no wonder why we are inching closer to World War III.
El objetivo de Rusia es únicamente neutralizar la amenaza de esa Ucrania que ha sido militarizada y nazificada por la OTAN.
Russia's ultimate objective isn't to conquer, it is for the neutralization of Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, and the protection of the peoples of the eastern regions and Donbass.
La economía de Rusia crece más deprisa que la de las potencias occidentales.
The Russian economy has not been destroyed by this war. On the contrary, the Russian economy is growing as a result of this war, having the opposite intended effect of what the U.S. sanctions put on Russia early in 2022.
¿Y cómo consigue Rusia que su economía crezca? Lo consigue gracias a la simpatía y el apoyo que recibe del sur global, que ya está harto del saqueo, del pillaje, de las imposiciones de los estados imperialistas.
With the position of the United States in the world and its colonialism and aggression against the peoples of South America,
La OTAN pierde en todos los frentes contra Rusia, China, Palestina, Irán, Siria, Yemen, África.
NATO puts itself on the aggressive path against against fronts across the world, against Russia, China, Palestine, Syria, and other parts of the world.
Y también pierde la cabeza empujando al mundo hacia el abismo de la guerra nuclear.
This also risks and could result in a potential nuclear war.
Solo la lucha de los trabajadores y de los pueblos puede impedirlo.
Slava Donbass.
Only the people and the working class of the world can stop this.
En España, las fuerzas partidarias de la paz hemos lanzado la campaña Que no nos arrastren a la guerra.
In my country, Spain, the people are fighting back and resisting against the forces of reaction and imperialism.
Exigimos el cese inmediato del envío de armas y del entrenamiento militar a países en guerra.
We demand no entry of Spain into arming this current conflict and aiding in this war.
Exigimos el regreso inmediato de todas las tropas españolas desplegadas en el mundo.
We demand the withdrawal of all Spanish troops from all other parts of the world.
Exigimos la condena de la entidad sionista de Israel y la ruptura de relaciones diplomáticas y de todo tipo.
We demand the end of all relations with Israel, the Zionist entity, and all communications and all diplomatic relations in total.
Exigimos la adhesión de España a la querella contra Israel ante la Corte Internacional de Justicia.
We demand the prosecution and the aid of Spain in the prosecution of Israel in the International Criminal Court of the International Court of Justice.
Apoyamos plenamente a la resistencia palestina.
We support the resistance of the Palestinian people.
Exigimos la disminución radical del presupuesto militar.
We demand an end to this radical military escalation.
Exigimos la defensa de los derechos laborales de los trabajadores y la defensa de los servicios públicos de calidad.
We demand the defense of public services, the rights of the workers and all working people.
Y finalmente exigimos la salida de España de la OTAN y el cierre de las bases militares americanas.
And in the end, we demand utmost the exit of Spain from NATO and all American bases from the territory of Spain. Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Disband NATO!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Free, free Palestine!
Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Who's next? Me? Okay. Hello. Hello, hello. We are standing here in the heart of the beast, the heart of the U.S. empire, which ever since 1945 has demanded complete subjugation of the world to its whims. We as Americans fought a war. We fought World War II against Nazi Germany, imperialist Japan, and fascist Italy. Yet today, in contrary to where we stood back in the days of World War II at the center point of an anti-fascist alliance, allied with Russia, allied with China, allied with Britain, now we stand at the head of a global fascist alliance. And this alliance is called NATO. NATO today, spanning countries across Europe, spanning across the world with its foreign partners in Israel, Japan, South Korea, and other countries, NATO's no longer just the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO is a global terrorist organization, not confining itself to the Atlantic and Europe, but spreading its talons across the entire world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the progressive and the people's democracies of Eastern Europe, all bets were off. NATO immediately began dismantling neutral countries. NATO attacked Yugoslavia. It bombed Belgrade. It butchered Yugoslavian children. It incited ethnic tension and division amongst the people of Yugoslavia, and it destroyed Yugoslavia. And this is a so-called defensive alliance. There's nothing defensive what NATO did to Yugoslavia and later Serbia. Not ending with this aggression, NATO also spread its talons and destroyed Libya, the most prosperous country on the African continent, who wanted to start an African dollar, who is building infrastructure across the world, who is a beacon of stability and prosperity in Africa. NATO bombs turned the most prosperous country in Africa into a country that is still dealing with the civil war and has open slave markets. Before NATO, you had prosperity. After NATO, you had slave markets. And to finish it all off, NATO today has precipitated and is escalating the war in Ukraine. The war raged by Ukraine against the peoples of Donbass and the peoples of eastern Ukraine, who resisted a coup d'etat in 2014, which overthrew the elected government of Ukraine. Today, we are on the precipice of nuclear war. We are endangered by nuclear war. The United States has been withdrawing from treaties. It began under the Bush administration with withdrawal from the START treaties, and it was completed under the Trump administration by the withdrawal of the United States from whatever remained of the INF denuclearization treaties that were intended to ban large nuclear weapons. Seeing the withdrawal of the United States from these nuclear treaties, which were made at the end of the Cold War to make sure that the threat of Armageddon would never occur again, Russia and China and all of the global powers have been rearming. They've been increasing their nuclear weapon arsenals. And why? Because of the United States, because of U.S. imperialism, because of the U.S. lack of principles and lack of diplomacy and lack of any kind of foreign policy which is beneficial to the peoples of the world or beneficial to the United States. We Americans, seeing all this, while at the same time our roads are crumbling, our infrastructure is crumbling, we're losing jobs in this country. Children can't get to school on time because schools are closed, because there's potholes in the roads, because the busing system in this country is collapsing, because mom and dad can't afford gasoline in their cars anymore, thanks to U.S. imperialism. We are dealing with this while at the same time funding more than 800 military bases abroad. And for what? Our taxpayer money is going abroad instead, where it should be focused at home. The only taxpayer dollars that should be spent should be at home for bettering the lives of American working families and the working class of America. But no, the Democratic and Republican parties have demanded that we as the American taxpayers sacrifice our blood, our sweat, our taxpayer dollars for this NATO alliance, for wars abroad. Are we going to stand for this as the American people? No! We as Americans must demand the exit of the United States from NATO. We must demand a program to rebuild this country, to build new trains, to build new infrastructure, to make sure all children of America get proper education, to ensure that American working families don't have to worry about the lack of housing, the lack of jobs, the lack of infrastructure in this country. We need to demand, as Americans, a new 1776, but this time not against the British, against NATO, against this globalist imperialist system, which is destroying our country and is destroying the potential of our country. Why are we giving all these money to Europeans who are building up their military industrial complexes, who are oppressing and using the resources of Africa for their benefit, who are laying rich and getting rich off of the wealth of the American people, which is being spent abroad instead of at home? We need to stop this. NATO needs to end. The two-party system needs to go. The Democratic and Republican parties have sold our country down the river, and we demand an end to this capitalist system, an end to the system of imperialism, an end to the system of globalism, and the building of a new world that's built upon prosperity between the peoples of the United States, Russia, China, Africa, India. All nations should be at peace. All nations deserve prosperity. All nations deserve self-determination. And the best way we could achieve this goal is by withdrawing from NATO and building a government of the working class here at home. Not of the big bankers, not of the elites, not of the Democrats and Republicans, but of American working families. Thank you.
Disband NATO!
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 Free Palestine!
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 The people united!
Will never be defeated!
The people united!
Will never be defeated!
Thank you.